Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching, whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. She found the ring on a Tuesday. It was sitting in the lining of Colt's old work jacket, the brown canvas one he'd left folded on the barn peg when he rode out with the Vane gang at dawn, small and plain and still wrapped in a strip of leather like he'd been carrying it for months and hadn't yet decided what to do with a thing he'd stopped believing he'd ever use. Wren Calloway stood in that barn with the ring in her palm and her breath completely still in her chest, and she understood three things simultaneously: that he had never stopped wanting to ask her again, that he had bought the ring sometime in the months after she told him no, and that he had left it behind. The morning he rode away, not forgotten, but deliberately, left like a door swung shut and locked from the other side. She had made a decision in April, in a kitchen garden, with her jaw set and her practical heart doing what it always did. And this ring, this small, terrible ring, was the full weight of what that decision had cost. She closed her fingers around it. The metal was cold. And then she looked again and found the other thing, a small sprig of dried sage, curled and pressed flat, wrapped in the same leather strip alongside the ring. She lifted it to her face. It still smelled of the kitchen garden, dry and sharp and faintly green, the exact smell of an April evening that had never stopped existing inside her. He had kept both, the ring for the question, the sage for the place he'd asked it. She stood in that barn with both of them in her palm for a very long time, and she did not put them down. An hour earlier, she had been standing at the edge of Dustwater's main street watching him go. He was 20 yards away, saddling a gun-grey stallion she'd never seen before, wearing a black duster that wasn't his, a dark grey Stetson sitting wrong on his head, where his battered brown hat used to be. Two men flanked him, thick-shouldered and still in the specific way of men who had replaced fear with repetition, men who'd done enough dangerous things that danger had stopped feeling different from everything else. Wren knew those men. Everyone in Dustwater knew those men. They rode for Silas Vane. She had crossed her arms tight against her chest, not for warmth, though the November wind off the Tiburon Flats was sharp enough to taste, but because something in her had recognized that if she didn't hold herself very deliberately together in that moment, she was going to do something she could not take back, like cross the street, like say his name, like tell him the thing she had been composing and discarding for 7 months in the space between sleeping and waking. There had been a moment, one breath, the duration of a candle's flicker, where Colt turned his head and found her without searching. His eyes reached hers the way they had always reached hers, pulled by something older and more reliable than intention. She had watched his jaw tighten. She had seen the ghost of everything they'd been moved through his face like weather. His hand stilled on the saddle strap. One of Vane's men said something low, and whatever had almost happened closed over and disappeared, the way water closes over a dropped stone. Colt swung up into the saddle, easy, graceful, the motion of a man who had grown up on horseback, and for whom that particular action still held no hesitation, even when everything else did. He clicked once. The grey horse moved. He rode south. He did not look back, not once, not at the bend where Dustwater's main road curved toward the Cimarron Flats and the horizon, and Wren stood in the street with the cold working into her through her boots, and she kept her face still and her eyes dry because she would not give this town a piece of her grief to carry around and retell. She saved it. She saved it for the barn and the jacket, and the ring she hadn't known existed until she found it 40 minutes later, cold and plain and devastating in her open hand. Deputy Amos Hale had been watching from the saloon porch. She'd registered him without looking directly at him, because Wren had grown up in a household where the most important information was always at the edges of a room, not its centre. Beside Amos stood a stranger, lean, grey-coated, with a leather document case under one arm and a small notebook in the other, pencil moving fast, eyes tracking Colt's departure with the focused attention of a man cataloguing something, rather than witnessing it. She filed him away. She filed everything away. There would be time later to understand what she'd seen. Right now she was doing the only thing available, keeping her feet on the ground and her breathing, even while the architecture of the last 2 years, the thing she had built and then starved and then convinced herself was merely dormant, finished collapsing in the open air of a Tuesday morning that smelled like iron and old decisions. She walked home alone, the red cimarron dust working into her eyelashes, gritty and dry between her teeth, and she did not hurry, because hurrying would have meant she was running from something, and Wren Calloway did not run from things. She walked toward them, even when they were going to break her. Back at the ranch, she stood in the yard and looked at the tired house with its leaning fence and her mother's small brave kitchen garden, and she asked herself the question she'd been avoiding since April. Had she made the right choice? Her fingers found the ring again in her coat pocket. She'd put it there without deciding to, the way your hand finds something it needs before your mind has caught up. The metal had warmed slightly from her body heat, and that small change, that tiny, irreversible shift from cold to warm, undid something in her that all the controlled breathing in the world couldn't hold. She sat down on the porch step. The wind moved through the sage in the garden. The north fence leaned in the way it had been leaning since August, patient and uncorrected, and inside Wren's chest, quiet and heavy and entirely without drama, the question she'd been asking was answered. Yes, she had made the wrong choice, but she was not someone who stayed inside wrong choices once she'd identified them. She was someone who fixed things, starting now, starting with whatever was left to fix. She was going to fix this. He hadn't arrived by accident. That was the thing Wren would not discover until much later, and the thing that would reframe everything when she did. At the time, the summer of his arrival looked like luck, a capable drifter appearing at a failing ranch at the exact moment one was needed. He came up the South Road in July on a good horse, not a showy horse, a working horse, the kind chosen for endurance rather than impression, and he called up to Wren on the roof and said his name was Colt Maddox, and he'd heard they needed a hand. Wren looked at him from 20 feet up, hammer in her grip, the July sun already pressing hard at 10 in the morning, and she registered the length of him in the saddle, the quality of stillness around him that was not disinterest but self-containment, and she said, "Come in." She hired him the same morning, 30 cents a day plus supper, and he started work within the hour, as if the conversation about wages had been a formality he'd already settled in his own mind before she'd agreed to it. That should have been her first indication, but you don't always recognize a man's preparedness for something until you understand what he'd prepared for. Through that summer and into autumn, Colt Maddox rebuilt the Calloway Ranch in the patient, systematic way of someone who understood both wood and time. He was up before the light. He fixed the things that were about to break before they broke, which was rarer than it sounded. Most people fixed what was already broken, which meant they were always behind. He fixed the fence posts in August before they failed. He rehung the barn door before the autumn winds would have torn it. He noticed the water trough developing a slow leak and sealed it on a Wednesday, with nothing said about it, so that on Thursday Wren came out, and it was done, and she stood looking at it for a moment before she understood. She found over those months that she'd stopped dreading the morning inventory, the daily catalogue of what the ranch had lost overnight, what had broken or rotted or given up. Because when Colt was there, the inventory kept coming back shorter. The place was stabilizing, quietly, without announcement, the way all the best things stabilized. Her father Fletcher watched with the expression of a man whose grudging respect was fighting hard against his pride and losing by narrow margins. He said one evening on the porch, "He works like a man who owes somebody something," Wren had said, or like a man who wants something. Fletcher had gone quiet, which was his version of disagreement when the other person wasn't entirely wrong. Her mother Nora, thinner now, resting more but still sharp in the way of women who'd had to be, she had said something different. She'd watched Colt through the kitchen window one afternoon and then turned to Wren and said, almost to herself, "He knew your father's name before he arrived. I heard him say it to his horse when he came through the gate. He said Fletcher Calloway's place, like he was confirming an address." Wren had looked at her mother. Nora had looked back. Neither of them said another word about it, but Wren had turned the information over in her mind for weeks, the way you turn a stone you found that's heavier than its size suggests. And the question it raised, why would a drifter know her father by name before arriving, remained unanswered for longer than it should have. She let it slide. She let herself be too busy to pursue it. She would regret that eventually. What grew between them through those months was not the loud, breathless thing from stories. It was structural, like the fence Colt fixed, quiet, load-bearing, built to hold weight. She learned him in increments, that he was from New Mexico, that his father had died young and badly, that he had a younger sister named Clara in Santa Fe, who he sent money to every month in a plain envelope with no return address, which struck Wren as the most specifically gentle detail she'd ever learned about a person. She learned that he didn't drink to forget things, which meant he had things he'd decided to carry rather than dissolve. She learned that when he was thinking hard, he went completely still, not distant still, the way still water is still, present all the way down. And she learned that when he looked at her, really looked, not the casual glance of proximity, there was something in his eyes that nobody had ever put there before, and that the name for it was not attraction or interest or admiration, but something much simpler and much harder. He saw her. Not the Calloway daughter, not the woman on the roof, not the capable, competent manager of a struggling property. Her. Whatever was underneath all of that. He saw it, and he did not look away from it, and Wren Calloway, who had spent 23 years being looked past by nearly everyone, found that the experience of being genuinely seen was, against all expectation, almost more than she could hold. The evening on the water tower happened in October, when the Cimarron sky went the particular shade of violet. It only went in autumn, deep and bruised and luminous all at once, and they sat side by side on the tank's wooden platform, watching the sun pull the colour out of everything below, while filling the sky with it instead. He had climbed up without asking, which was the kind of thing that would have irritated her from anyone else, and from him felt like the most natural thing in the world, as though the space beside her had always had his shape in it. They said almost nothing. The silence between them was the full, weighted kind. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but of people who have too much and are choosing to let it rest. The stars came out one by one above the Cimarron, and the sage smell drifted up from the dark below, and Wren was aware, as clearly as she'd ever been aware of anything, that something was happening that she did not have a word for yet, and did not want to name too quickly, the way you don't speak too loudly near something fragile. And somewhere in the dark field below them, completely unnoticed, a rider had stopped on the sea, south rode and watched the water tower for a full minute before turning his horse east. She did not see him. She was looking at the stars. His name was Silas Vane, and he had been watching the Callaway Ranch for 3 weeks, but that part of the story would not arrive until autumn. He asked her in April in the kitchen garden, among the sage, and the first green things trying their way back up through the turned earth. And the way he asked her was simple and direct and without theatre, because by then he knew her well enough to know that theatre would have been an insult. He said, "Wren, I want to marry you." Not would you, not will you, want to. The distinction was precise, and she registered it fully. Not a question with an escape built into the grammar, but a statement of fact about his interior life placed in front of her, like a hand extended, open and unheld back. She looked at his face in the early April light, and she saw everything there was to see in it, the want and the vulnerability of the want, and underneath it the certainty, the deep-rooted, steady certainty of a man who had decided this so long ago it had stopped feeling like a decision and had simply become part of his architecture. Inside her chest something loosened, something wound tight and long defended simply let go, the way a fist opens when the reason for the fist is finally over. She loved him, not as a discovery, she'd known it for months, but as an arrival. She had arrived at it completely, and the word yes was there, formed and real, and requiring only her voice to make it actual. Into the space before her voice could give it shape came her father's face, not the gentle one, not the proud one, the other face, the one that appeared whenever an envelope arrived from Amarillo. Flat and tight and internal, a man converting panic into posture. Fletcher Callaway owed money to 3 different men in 2 counties, and the debt had a shape Wren had traced from fragments. Overheard. Words. Partially visible ledger entries. The body language of her parents' kitchen silences after dark. The number was specific and large and due, and it sat between her and the word yes like a stone in a river. Colt had 30 cents a day, a horse and a sister in Santa Fe. He was everything she wanted and nothing the debt required. She had told herself for months that she would find a way to reconcile those 2 facts. Standing in the garden with his open face in front of her, she understood that she had not found a way. She had only found a postponement, and postponement, she was about to discover, had a cost she had not yet priced. She said, "I can't, not right now. The ranch, my parents, the timing isn't." She stopped herself before right, because the word right felt like one lie too many. She watched him hear her, watched his face process it with the particular speed of a person receiving information they had prepared for and hoped would not arrive. He didn't collapse, or argue, or perform anything. He stood with it. He nodded, once, slowly, the way you nod when something is settled, even though nothing should be settled yet. He said, "All right," 2 syllables, "all right," but the way it came out, quiet, resolved, with the specific texture of a door being shut firmly on a room he'd furnished carefully for a long time, told her everything she needed to know about what she'd just done. She had not simply said, "not yet." She had told him, in the language of the decision itself, that other things mattered more than he did. And Colt Maddox, who had come to this ranch knowing her father's name before he arrived, who had stayed through winter on reduced pay, who had a ring in the lining of a jacket she didn't know about yet, absorbed that information and filed it in the place where men file the things that change the direction of everything. He picked up the twine she'd set down and kept working. She stood beside him in the sage-smelling evening and did the same. They were careful with each other after that, in the specific careful way of people managing something fragile, by agreeing without words not to touch it directly. He was still at the ranch the next morning, and the morning after, and for all the mornings of the following months, and his work did not change, and his courtesy did not change, and almost nothing on the surface changed, except the thing that had always been between them. That specific charged quality of shared space, the feeling of being in the same room as someone who was also in your interior life. That quality changed. It didn't vanish. It thinned. The way a fire thins when you stop feeding it. Still there, still warm, if you put your hand near it, but no longer filling the room. She noticed this the way she noticed the fence posts leaning. Gradually, then all at once, and then too late. The months passed. She waited for the debt situation to improve. She waited for the right moment to say the thing she hadn't said. She was very practiced at patience, Wren Calloway. What she was not practiced at was the difference between patience and paralysis. Her mother said it plainest, one September evening, watching Colt through the kitchen window as he stacked wood in the dark yard, the lantern on the porch throwing his shadow long behind him across the dust. Nora said, "He knows you love him." Wren said, "Mama." Nora said, "He's going to stop waiting, Wren. Good men aren't patient forever. They're patient until they have enough evidence that patience is the wrong response, and then they adapt. That's what makes them good." Wren looked at her mother's thin, accurate face in the lamplight. She said, "The debt," Nora said, "would survive you being happy. It has survived most other things." She turned from the window and picked up her mending and did not look at Wren again, which was the way Nora closed a conversation she'd finished with. Wren stood at the window alone and watched Colt in the yard. Below, the lantern light on his shoulders, the set of his back, the way he stacked the wood with the same quiet attention he brought to everything. And she thought, tomorrow, she would find a way to tell him tomorrow. Tomorrow arrived, and she did not tell him. A week later, Silas Vane came through the south gate of Dustwater, and tomorrow became a word that no longer meant what she thought it meant. Silas Vane walked into Dustwater's saloon on a Wednesday evening in October and bought the whole bar a round of drinks, which was how certain kinds of men introduced themselves, not with words, but with the language of generosity that was really the language of dominance, dressed in good fabric. He was medium height and lean, with a dark pointed beard kept precise, and a pair of eyes that looked at everything with a quality. Wren, watching from the far end of the bar over a glass of water she hadn't ordered, identified immediately and precisely he was not observing the room. He was inventorying it. There was a difference. Observers take in what is offered. Inventory takers decide what has value. She watched him work the room, the handshake with Amos Hale that lasted a beat too long, calculated flattery disguised as friendliness, and she thought, this man has been in 100 rooms like this one. And then she thought something that stopped the first thought cold. This man has been in this room before, not literally, but in the particular way he moved to the bar's far corner, the specific angle from which he chose to stand. It was the angle of a man who already knew the sight lines, who had, possibly, mapped them in advance. She noted this and said nothing, and drank her water and watched. The second thing she noticed, the thing that did not become fully significant until later, was that Vane already knew Colt's name. She was close enough to hear when Vane first approached Colt at the hitching post the following afternoon, and what she heard was not introduction, but continuation. Vane had said, "Maddox, the way you say a name you've been carrying, not the way you repeat a name you've just been given." He'd said it like a file label, like something organized and waited upon. And Colt had gone very still, not surprised still, which would have been quick and reactive, but prepared still. The stillness of a man who'd been expecting this particular conversation and had not decided yet how to have it. She stood at the corner of the assay office, and she put those two facts together. Vane knowing the sight lines, Vane knowing Colt's name, and the shape they made in combination was something she did not want to look at directly. It suggested that Vane's arrival in Dustwater was not opportunistic. It was targeted, and the target was standing at the hitching post in a brown canvas jacket, listening to a man who had known exactly where to find him. She thought about what her mother had said. He knew your father's name before. He arrived. She thought about the rider she hadn't seen in October, watching the water tower from the South Road. She thought about the man from Amarillo with his legal case and his notebook, the one who'd been at the saloon the morning Colt rode out, writing fast. Individually, each of these was a fragment. Arranged together, they formed a question she didn't want to ask, because the answer it pointed toward was too ugly. That someone, somewhere, had known about the Callaway Ranch's debt situation, and about Colt's position inside it, and had sent Vane to Dustwater not to pass through, but to acquire something, or someone. She sat with this possibility for a full day, turning it, looking for the flaw in the logic. She didn't find one. What she found instead was a worse version of the same thought, that if Colt had originally arrived at the Callaway Ranch knowing her father's name, and Vane arrived in Dustwater knowing Colt's name, then the chain of knowledge had a direction, and its direction pointed from somewhere Wren couldn't see yet toward everything she had. She confronted none of this directly. She had no evidence, only architecture, the shape that facts made when arranged. And architecture wasn't accusation, so she watched instead, with the focused patience of someone who has accepted that the truth is coming, and the only question is how quickly she can reach it before it reaches her. She watched Colt in the days after Vane's arrival, the new tension in him purposeful and resolved in a way that was different from his usual quality of resolution, the way he came back from town later, the money that appeared without clear origin. The night she woke at 2 a.m. and his bunk in the barn was empty and his horse was gone, and he came back before dawn with the smell of distant fire on his coat. Not wood smoke and hearth, but open ground fire, the kind that happened far from any building. She noticed the ring of bruising around his right, knuckles that he didn't explain. She noticed, most painfully, that when he looked at her now, there was something new layered over the old warm thing, not replacing it, but covering it, the way frost covers a field. You knew the grass was still there. You could see the shape of it, but you could not reach it without breaking through something cold first. On Thursday evening she went to him in the barn. She had spent 2 days composing what she'd say. Not a speech, she didn't do speeches, but the essential words in their most useful order. She opened the barn door, and the lamplight fell across him, where he sat sharpening a knife with the slow, methodical focus he brought to things when his mind was somewhere else entirely. He looked up at her. She said, "Colt, I need to say something." He set the whetstone down. He looked at her, with the old warmth present just beneath the frost, and said, "Wren, don't." She said, "I'm not done yet. You need to hear." He said, "I know what you're going to say." She said, "Then let me say it out loud." He looked at her for a long moment, and then, very quietly, he said, "I've made arrangements that I can't undo without cost. I'm not willing to let others pay." She understood what that meant. She stood in the barn doorway in the lamplight, and she understood that she had waited 7 months too long, and that the window she had been so certain still existed had closed while she was standing in front of it, convinced she still had time. The Amarillo stagecoach robbery happened on a Monday, 8 minutes of clean professional violence 12 miles east of Dustwater, and nobody was physically hurt, which was the detail Colt carried like a permit. Proof, he told himself, that there were still lines he hadn't crossed. He'd stood at the rear of the formation with his bandana drawn and held 2 horses and said nothing threatening to anyone, and technically, in the moral accounting he was running, had done something closer to enabling than participating. This was the kind of logic a man constructed when he was trying to live in two places at once, the place he'd always been and the place he was heading, and needed the gap between them to feel crossable rather than vertical. The trouble with this logic, which Colt understood somewhere below the level where he was willing to name it, was that Silas Vane had also told him the stagecoach job was one time, temporary, a bridge, not a road, and Vane had said it in the calm, factual tone of a man who had built many bridges for many men who had told themselves the same thing, and Vane knew, because he was Vane, that the bridge was always the road. The men who crossed once always crossed again. He'd never met an exception. Wren heard about the robbery by mid-morning the next day through Dustwater's invisible telegraph of gossip and fear. She was at the general store buying cloth for her mother when she heard it described in 8 different versions, each slightly larger than the last, and in every version a specific detail lodged in her like a splinter. One of the passengers had noted that among the 4 riders, one had moved with the unmistakable ease of a man who'd lived his whole life on horseback, graceful even in a violent moment, which was a specific kind of wrongness that could only come from a specific kind of right. Her hand tightened on the cloth bolt. She kept her face still and said to Marisol at the counter, "Terrible. I hope Amos puts a proper search together." Marisol said she hoped so too. They both understood, without saying so, that Amos would not put anything together, because Amos was a man who wore a badge, the way some men wore a hat, not to do something, but to look like something. Wren paid for the cloth and walked out and stood in the cold street and breathed the sea marron dust that always coated the back of your throat this time of year, and she located what she was feeling with clinical accuracy: grief. The specific grief of being right about something you'd needed to be wrong about. She let herself feel it for exactly the time it took to walk to her horse. Then she tied it away and went to find him. She found Colt in the barn, cleaning tack with the focused, hands-busy quality of a man keeping his body occupied while his mind was somewhere it didn't want to be. She closed the barn door. He looked up. She crossed the barn and stood close enough that their history was a physical presence between them, close enough that the warmth coming off him was something she could feel against her face. She said, "Colt." He set the lever down. He said, "Wren." She said, "Come back." Not come back to the ranch. He knew what she meant. She knew he knew. And she saw it. The full shape of his want, the version of him that was still who he'd always been, surfacing through everything he'd built on top of it. And she was certain, for one breath, absolutely certain, that he was going to reach for it. He looked at her and his jaw worked, and he said, "You told me no." She said, "I know." He said, "You said the timing wasn't." She said, "I was wrong. I was afraid, and I called it practical, and I was wrong." The word wrong came out cracked at the edges. She let it. He heard it. She watched the cracked word land. He stood. He was taller than she'd remembered, or the barn was smaller, and the lamp threw his shadow long up the wall behind him, and he looked at her the way he'd looked at her on the water tower, but different now, layered with something newer and heavier. He said, "Wren." Her name in his mouth was barely a breath, more air than sound. Then he said, "I think you have to let me go." She said, "I'm not." He said, "Not forever, not." He stopped, started again, his voice rougher. "I made a thing with Vane. I can't. He doesn't let people walk out clean. He'd come for me. And for..." He didn't finish that sentence. He looked at her, and she understood the shape of the unfinished sentence with her whole body. He meant her. He meant the ranch. He meant Nora in the thin-walled house, and Fletcher with his debt, and the kitchen garden, and all of it. He wasn't choosing the gang over her. He was choosing her safety over her presence. And that distinction, true as it was, did not make the barn feel any less like a room with no exit. She opened her mouth. He turned away from her first, back to the tack, his hands moving again, steady and purposeful, and the steadiness of them was somehow the worst part, like he'd already decided and settled it, like he'd had time to practice. She held his face in her peripheral vision as he worked, and she read what was there, the way she read all things, carefully, without letting her own need distort the signal. What she found was not peace. It was the specific steadiness of a man who had built a lie he needed to believe, and was living inside it with the discipline of someone who understood that the moment he stopped believing it, everything it was holding up would fall. The lie was this, that 6 months with Vane, enough money sent to Clara in Santa Fe, enough margin cleared on the operation to step back on his own terms, was a temporary road back to everything this barn still smelled of. The work, the ranch, the kitchen garden, and the woman who tended it. He had told himself the Vane road led home. She could see it clearly from the outside, because she had told herself a version of it for 7 months. More time. Reconcilable facts. The right moment coming. She had been wrong. He was wrong. And the steadiness of his hands. The practiced, armour-plated steadiness of a man inside a lie that still felt like his best option, was the most devastating thing she had witnessed since the morning he rode away. She walked out of the barn into the dark of the pasture, and she let herself cry there, fully and completely, and without management, bent forward with her hands on her knees and the cold grass, while the Cimarron stars watched without comment. She let it run its full length. Then she straightened and wiped her face with the back of her wrist, and she breathed the dry, iron-tasting air, and she said, out loud, to nobody at all, to the cold and the dark and the indifferent stars, I am not done. Not a promise, not a declaration, just a fact, the same tone she'd used to say the fence needs fixing or the water trough is low. Just a thing that was true and was going to require work and would be attended to. She turned towards the house. Above her, the Cimarron sky was full of stars so dense they seemed to press down against the dark like flour against a sieve, and she walked through the cold grass toward the lamplight in the kitchen window, and she had already, by the time she pushed through the door, begun to think. She began with what she knew and built outward from there. The way you build a fire. Start small and certain, and add fuel only when the thing beneath it is fully caught. What she knew. Vane's gang had been in Dustwater 3 weeks past the date they'd said they were passing through. That was one coal. The stagecoach job had yielded significant cash, but not the kind of yield that justified 7 men riding together this far from their operating territory. That was a second coal. Vane had specifically sought out Colt, who was local, who had spent 18 months learning every road and ridgeline and property boundary within 40 miles of Dustwater. That knowledge, intimate, current, specific, was worth more to a planning operation than any gun. That was the third coal, and when she placed it alongside the other 2 and fed the whole thing a breath, the fire it made was not the shape of a passing robbery. It was the shape of something deliberate, something targeted, something requiring an inside map of a specific place. She let that fire burn in her mind for a full day before she moved, because moving before a thing was fully alight, got you smoke and no heat, and she needed heat. She went to the saloon under the pretext of a message for Amos Hale. Fictional, a story about a stray horse found near the Brennan property, constructed with enough specific detail to survive casual questioning, and she stood at the bar nursing a cup of coffee that tasted of burned grain and tin, and she listened, not to conversations directed at her, to the room. She'd learned young that a room, if you went quiet enough inside yourself, would simply talk to you, sentences completing themselves across 15 feet of open air, fragments catching on the edge of your attention, like seeds on wool. She heard one of Vane's men, the lean one who drank bourbon past the second glass and became gradually less careful about the distance between his inside voice and his outside one, say something to his companion that contained 3 words in a sequence that locked her breathing for a full second. Vault, Thursday, before the operator closes. Vault was not an accident. Thursday was not a coincidence. Before the operator closes meant before midnight, because the telegraph office in Dustwater closed at 11:30, which she knew because she passed it every time she rode to town and had seen the hand-painted hours on the door every single time. The Dustwater Cattleman's Bank, Thursday, before midnight. She drank the rest of the terrible coffee without tasting it and set the cup down and said good evening to Marisol and walked out into the cold street. She was standing outside the saloon in the cold street when it fully assembled. Not just the bank plan, she'd understood that for 2 minutes, but the deeper thing, the one she had been circling since October, since her mother said he knew your father's name before he arrived, the man from Amarillo. She had misidentified him entirely. Legal case, small notebook, pencil moving fast, tracking Colt's departure that November morning with the cataloguing. Attention of a man confirming an expected outcome, not a creditor, not a consolidator, an agent sent to confirm delivery. She stood in the Cimarron dust, and the iron taste of it was suddenly specific and sharp on the back of her throat, and the thing she had been too busy, too hopeful, too afraid to fully look at resolved itself in the cold light, like a photograph developing in a tray. Fletcher Calloway's debt had been purchased by someone upstream of Vane, bought deliberately, accelerated deliberately. The pressure applied to this ranch for the past 2 years was not random disaster. It was manufactured. Someone had needed Colt Maddox desperate enough to look for alternatives, and they had built that desperation themselves, one unpayable note at a time, using her family as the mechanism and Colt as the product. The chain ran from a desk in Amarillo to Silas Vane, to a man in a barn she had loved him in. She breathed, once. Then she went to Amos Hale. Amos heard her out with the expression of a man being asked to carry something heavier than he'd agreed to carry. He turned his hat in his hands while she talked, around and around, the leather brim going through his fingers in slow rotation, which was his nervous habit, and which she'd always found telling in a lawman. When she finished, he said, "Wren, a drunk man talking loud in a saloon doesn't constitute," she said. "Amos, 7 men, the bank vault, Thursday. That is what I heard." He said he'd look into it. She looked at his face when he said it. His eyes had gone to the window, not to her. His jaw was held tight in the specific way of a man converting fear into the posture of authority. She left his office and stood in the cold street, and the Cimarron dust worked between her teeth the way it always did, gritty, mineral, the taste of the earth this country was made of, and she felt the clean, specific fury of a woman who is right about something and has been sent away by a man who is afraid of what being right would require. She breathed through it. Fury was energy. She would use it. She made her decision before she reached the end of the street. She would go to the county sheriff in Adelanto, Rufus Carmody, whom she'd met twice and assessed both times as a man whose primary feature was function rather than politics, 22 miles east. She could ride it in under 3 hours in the dark if she pushed her horse and didn't stop for anything. She would leave before dawn Wednesday. But first she would do one other thing. She would ride to Vane's camp and find Colt. Not to beg him back, not anymore, but because she knew something Carmody would need. The camp's location, the number of men, the internal layout of the operation. And Colt was the only person on earth she trusted to give it to her accurately. She packed the saddlebag herself after supper. 1 bedroll, a day's worth of dried beef and hardtack, and beneath the right flap, where her hand could reach it in under 3 seconds, her father's Navy Colt revolver, loaded oiled and cold as the November night she was going to ride out into. She did not plan to use it, but Wren Calloway had stopped making plans that didn't account for every direction the wind might turn. She rode north in the first hour of Wednesday, the Cimarron night enormous around her, in the way it was only enormous when you were alone in it. Not the manageable wide sky visible from a window or a porch, but the actual thing pressing in from every direction at once, cold and vast and indifferent, in a way that was not threatening but was completely honest. There was no moon. The stars gave just enough light to see the trail as a slightly paler strip through the dark grass, and she followed it the way you followed things you couldn't see fully, by feel, by instinct, by knowing the terrain well enough that even in the dark the ground told her what she needed. The horse's breath came in short white clouds, she felt, rather than saw, warm against her leg when the wind shifted right, and the saddle leather was stiff with cold and smelled of oil and animal, and the night sounds were all the small sounds of a country going dormant. Dry grass talking in the wind, something moving in the distant brush, the distant voice of the tributary she was navigating toward. Her hands on the reins were steady. Her mind was clear. Below all of that, in the place she kept things she wasn't ready to look at directly, she was afraid. She rode anyway. That was the only relevant fact. The camp revealed itself through smell before sight. Wood smoke and horse, and the particular acrid undertone of men who'd been in the field long enough to carry it in their coats. She tethered her horse to a cottonwood, 50 yards back, and moved on foot, low and slow, using the grass and the tributary's bend for cover. She counted 9 horses on the picket line, 2 more than she'd accounted for. She noted this, filed it, kept moving. The camp was professional in its arrangement. Main fire central, sentry positions at the 2 natural approach routes. Horses picketed upwind. Vane was not a careless man. She moved around the southern edge with her breathing deliberate and shallow, her boots finding the soft ground beside the harder path, moving slow enough that her steps were lost in the creek sounds and the wind. She found Colt at a smaller secondary fire, separate from the main camp, sitting alone on a flat rock with his elbows on his knees and his hands loose between them, staring into the coals with the expression of a man who had been staring into something for a long time without it giving him anything back. She memorized him for one breath, the firelight on his face, the old brown hat on the ground beside him, the specific quality of his stillness, the heaviness of it. And then she moved into the light. He went for his gun before he saw her. The instinct was instant, complete. Hand at the holster, body already shifted, and then her face resolved in the firelight, and he went absolutely still. Not the reaching stillness of before, but a struck stillness, the kind that happened when the body received information too large to process in a single moment. He said, "Wren," not a greeting, more like a wound naming itself. She crouched beside him and put her hand on his arm, over the gun hand, directly, deliberate, and she spoke fast and low. The bank, the vault, Thursday, the full scope of it, the people who would be caught in it, the scale that Vane had apparently not given him in clear terms. She watched his face as she spoke. She watched the architecture shift, his jaw set. His eyes went cold in the specific way of a man rearranging his moral interior in real time, the framing cracking and something underneath coming through. He said, "How many people are in that bank on a Thursday?" She said, "Payroll season. Practically every ranching family in 40 miles. He said, he didn't, he stopped, started again. He told me it was the operating account. Clean in and out. No, he said minimal contact. She said, 7 men, midnight. That's not minimal contact, Colt. That's a massacre dressed up as a robbery." He stood. He put distance between himself and the fire, which was what he did when he was thinking, moved his body to clear his head, and she stood with him and watched him walk 3 paces and stop with his back to her and his hands at his sides, not fists, just open, hanging, the way hands hang when the argument you built has just been taken out from under you and you're standing in the space where it used to be. He said, without turning, "Come with me, right now, ride east. I'll take you to Carmody in Adelanto, and I'll testify to everything I know about this operation and..." He turned. His face in the firelight was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, stripped of everything managed, everything performed, everything that the last 7 months had deposited on top of who he actually was. He said, "I can't walk away from Vane and leave you in range of what he'd do about it." A pause. Something complicated moved behind his eyes. "Or your family." She understood. The ranch, her mother, all of it, held hostage by the radius of Vane's retribution. She opened her mouth to answer, and a branch cracked behind her with the specific weight and intention that no amount of wind or small creature accounted for. She turned. Vane's lean man was standing 10 feet away, still holding his playing cards, looking at her with an expression that had passed surprise 3 seconds ago and arrived somewhere considerably colder. They had her at the main fire inside of 3 minutes, professionally, without roughness, because Vane ran a professional operation right up until the moment he didn't. Silas Vane stood up from his log and looked at her and did not speak for a full 10 seconds, which she recognized as a performance of control and also as genuine. He was taller than she'd registered from across the saloon. He had a quality she found more disturbing than anger would have been. He was entirely comfortable. Not comfortable the way a man is comfortable in his own parlour, comfortable the way a man is comfortable in any room he's entered, because he has long since made peace with the fact that any room can become dangerous, and he has arranged his relationship with danger so thoroughly that it no longer announces itself as separate from everything else. He looked at Wren Calloway for those 10 seconds with the calculating dark eyes of a man reading a balance sheet. Then he smiled, not warmly, but with a precision that was almost its own kind of artistry. And he said, "Miss Calloway, I had wondered how long before we had this conversation." He said it as though she'd arrived for a scheduled appointment, as though she was the last piece of something he'd been arranging for a very long time. And somewhere in the warmth of the fire, with the Cimarron night pressing in around the camp, Wren felt the first genuine cold of real fear. Not for herself, but at the realization that she had been anticipated, that this man had seen her coming before she'd known she was going to move. Vane sat across from her on the log, the fire between them, 2 of his men standing at her flanks like furniture. And he asked how much she knew, and she told him 2/3 of it, deliberately, holding back the vault timing and the telegraph office detail and the specific hour. She presented herself as someone who'd caught the edge of a careless conversation, assembled an incomplete picture, and come to verify it with the only person who could confirm it. Logic he couldn't argue with because it was true enough. He listened with his head slightly tilted, which was how he listened to everything, like a man triangulating your actual position from the direction of your sound. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You went to Amos Hale," she said. "He didn't believe me." Vane nodded, not because he was relieved. His face didn't register relief. She didn't think he experienced it as a separate sensation, but because it confirmed a calculation. He said, "Amos believes what it's comfortable to believe. Most people do." He picked up a small stick and turned it in the fire's edge without looking away from her. "That's not weakness. It's survival strategy. A man protects himself from information that would require him to act, because acting is expensive and inaction is free. The whole moral architecture of honest living is just a story people tell themselves so they don't have to admit that every day they choose safety over courage and call it virtue. She looked at him. He said it so simply and so calmly, like a fact of weather, like he'd arrived at it through long observation and had no particular feeling about it anymore, the way a doctor has no particular feeling about the fact that people die. He said, "Your man Maddox. He came to me, did you know that? Not the other way." She said nothing. He continued, "Good man. I mean that without sarcasm. A truly good man. Steady hands, reliable judgment, no appetite for unnecessary violence. Those qualities are rarer than you'd think in my line of work." He paused. "He came to me because 7 months ago something happened that cost him the future he'd been building, and a man without a future becomes available to alternatives." He looked at her directly then, and the look was not a blade. It was simply accurate, the way an accurate thing is always more unsettling than a cruel one. "You cost him his future, Miss Calloway. I gave him a new one. I think it's important you understand that before you make any decisions tonight, because the decisions you make will have consequences for him, and I'd prefer you to make them with clear information rather than sentiment." She met his eyes and kept her face still and thought, "This man is monstrous and completely correct, and those two things are not in contradiction." She filed the information. She would deal with what it meant later. Right now she needed to get out of this camp. She asked how much she knew. He asked it again, slightly differently, which told her he wasn't fully satisfied with her first answer. She gave him a slightly different version of the same 2/3, consistent with the first but with different emphasis, the way a truthful person restates something versus the way a liar does. He absorbed it. He looked at her. He looked at Colt, who had come from the secondary fire and was standing just outside the full ring of firelight, with his arms at his sides and his face closed. Something passed between Vane and Colt in that look. A negotiation conducted entirely without words, the kind only possible between people who know each other's operating terms well enough to speak in. Implication. Vane said, "She's a loose end, Maddox." His voice was even and unhurried, the voice of a man noting an accounting problem, implying its solution without requiring the ugliness of naming it. He said it, and then he stopped and waited, which was the most specific thing Wren had seen him do. The waiting. It was a test. And the thing being tested was not whether Colt would follow orders, but whether he'd become the version of himself that could. Wren breathed carefully, hands open in her lap, and waited with him. Colt said, "Let her go." His voice came out flat, not emotionless, flat the way a road is flat when it's been pressed down and settled by long use. Absolutely level. No variation in it, no crack, no appeal. Just statement. Vane turned his head slowly, deliberately, and looked at him. Colt said, "She doesn't have enough to stop us." Hale turned her away. "Holding her here creates the witness problem she doesn't have yet. Let her ride out and we proceed as planned." There was a silence in which Wren understood the full complexity of what Colt had just done. He had stripped the emotion from the argument so completely that Vane could not reject it on the grounds of sentiment. He had made the case for her release in Vane's own language, logic, risk calculation, operational efficiency, and, in doing so, had given Vane no purchase for suspicion. It was the most sophisticated act of protection she had ever witnessed, and it was also costing him something visible. She could see it in the slight whitening of his knuckles, where his hand rested on the hitching post, the thing he was pressing down while keeping his face still. Vane looked at her, looked at the fire, said, "She rides out now, alone. She goes home and she stays there until Friday." The word Friday landed with its full, specific weight. The job was Thursday. They walked her to a horse, and 2 of Vane's men followed her 200 yards south until the tributary bent and the Camp was out of sight, and then she was alone in the Cimmerian dark with the cold working through her coat, and the horse's breath warm against her hand, and the stars overhead, so present and indifferent they were almost company. She rode south for half a mile, the sound of the creek receding behind her, and then she stopped the horse and sat in the dark, and breathed long and controlled, until the thing in her chest that had been a fist for the last 2 hours slowly opened. She had a window, narrow, specific, bought at cost by a man standing in a ring of firelight, who had turned her survival into arithmetic because it was the only argument that would work. She owed him something for that. She could not pay it back with gratitude or presents or the words she still hadn't said. She could only pay it back with speed, by riding east and hard 22 miles to Adelanto and making the thing he'd bought for her count. She pressed her heels into the horse's flanks. The Cimarron, dark, opened around her. She rode. Rufus Carmody heard her out in full. He was already at his desk when she arrived before dawn, the kind of lawman who treated night as an extension of the working day, because trouble didn't stop at sundown, and neither did he, and he read the information she laid in front of him with the focused, systematic attention of someone performing triage. This is what we know. This is what we can verify. This is what we act on. He asked 2 questions. 2. Not 5, not 15. 2 precise questions that confirmed he'd understood the essential structure of what she was describing and was already past the point of assessing whether to believe her. He sent riders inside the hour. He arrived in Dustwater Thursday afternoon with 4 deputies, all in civilian clothes, and he placed them without drama in the buildings adjacent to the bank and at the east stable, where a 7-man mounted operation would naturally position their animals for fast exit. He was in and organised and invisible in the way of a man who understood that preparation was the only luxury a good ambush afforded. He found Amos Hale and told him, in a voice that was quiet and entirely final, to remain in his office for the duration of the evening. Amos, recognising the voice of actual authority, obeyed. Wren watched all of this from the 2nd floor of the post office building, her face at the dark window, and for the first time in weeks she allowed herself the specific, fragile sensation of having done the right thing in time. They came at 10:30, dark horses, hooves wrapped in cloth, moving fast along the west road, in a formation that split at the bank's corner, the way a practiced group splits. 3 points of entry, 2 escape routes covered, 1 man holding horses at the stable. Wren counted 6 visible riders, 1 she couldn't account for. The formation told Carmody's deputies the entry points before anyone drew a weapon. The street looked completely empty, swept clean, lampless, the kind of emptiness that should have felt wrong to 7 men who read terrain for a living. She pressed her palm against the cold glass and watched. She found Vane first. She knew him by the quality of his stillness in the saddle, that deliberate, calculating calm that made him visible even in the dark, the way a very still thing is visible when everything around it is in motion. And then she found Colt. She always found Colt. Her eyes had always found him first in any crowd, pulled by something involuntary and absolute. He was at the rear of the formation on the grey stallion, tall, recognisable, not drawing a weapon, not advancing, still holding horses, she thought, still on the edge, still in the gap between what he'd become and what he'd always been. Carmody's voice cut across the street like a blade. Silas Vane, hands where I can see them. The words were clear and final and landed in the cold air of Dustwater's main street the way a bell tone lands. You felt it in your chest before your mind had processed it. The 12 seconds that followed were the longest Wren had ever spent inside time. She counted them. The formation was still, horses shifting, No one moving, the street holding its breath, while 7 men recalculated in the dark. Then it broke, not in panic, in the mechanical, pre-decided way of a plan converting to its contingency, different riders pulling in different directions with the coordinated automaticity of something rehearsed. Guns came out. The first shot came from the south end of the street. Carmody's deputy controlled, targeting the rider breaking right. Then 2 more, close together, from the buildings flanking the bank. The street erupted, hoofbeats, shouts, the sharp, flat percussion of gunfire that always sounded in open air, less like violence and more like sudden punctuation, like the world hitting a hard stop after a very long run-on sentence. Wren kept her eyes moving. She tracked. Vane going south, his horse fast and controlled. She tracked 2 of his men going down, not dead, not positioned. She saw them clutch and slow, controlled falls. The specific falls of men hit in non-critical places by deputies trained to wound rather than kill when they could afford to choose. And then she tracked Colt. A deputy had him off the grey stallion in the first 30 seconds. Tackled, hard, the 2 of them going into the dirt of the main street, with the specific violence of a collision between a large man and a more determined one. She was out the door before she'd decided to move. She hit the street and crossed it at a run. Actual running, which she had not done in public in years, which she did not think about at all. And she reached them as the deputy was pulling Colt's wrists behind his back, and she said loud and clear, "This man cooperated with me. He released a hostage from the Vane camp. I'm Wren Calloway. I'm the woman who brought Carmody here. Tonight, note it." The deputy, young, thorough, the kind of young who was training to become Carmody rather than Amos, looked up at her, and then at Colt, and then back at her, and he wrote something in his notebook without argument. Colt was looking at her from the dirt of Dustwater's main street, with his cheek against the ground, and a cut over his eye already bleeding, and an expression she had never seen on him before, one she didn't fully have a word for yet. It was the expression of a man seeing clearly, for the first time, the total shape of the thing he'd almost become. Recognition, the painful, unglamorous, entirely necessary kind. Silas Vane was taken at the south edge of town 20 minutes later. His horse had taken a shot in the flank and gone lame before the town limits, and Carmody himself brought him back on foot. Cuffed, walking in the cold street with his hat still on, and his composure entirely intact, which was the most revealing thing about him. Even caught, even finished, he wore authority like a second skin. He looked at the deputies processing his men, looked at the bank, looked at Wren standing on the step of the general store. He said nothing to her. But when his eyes passed over her, they paused, briefly. 1 second, no more, with something in them that was not quite respect and not quite acknowledgement, but was the closest thing to either that a man like Vane was probably capable of offering. She held his gaze for that second and then looked away, first, deliberately, because she was done letting this man have any more of her attention than the situation required. Carmody confirmed the bank secure. 5 of Vane's men were in custody. 2 had gone into the Cimarron Dark and were subject to active pursuit. She sat down on the step because her legs, finally and without negotiation, stopped cooperating. She sat in the gunsmoke and the cold and the aftermath noise, and she breathed and let her hands shake for exactly 1 minute. Then she looked across the street to where Colt was sitting against the jailhouse wall with his wrists bound and the cut still bleeding over his eye and his head tilted back against the adobe. And she thought, not yet, but soon. She gave her testimony twice, not once, twice, to 2 different deputies in deliberate, consistent detail, because she understood that a case built on single testimony was a case built on 1 pillar, and 1 pillar was 1 fire from collapsing. She said everything that was true. Colt had come into the operation under economic desperation, not predation. He had secured her release from the camp by turning the argument for her survival into a logic problem Vane couldn't refuse, at cost to himself she had observed firsthand. He had urged her to go to Carmody in their conversation at the campfire, which was not the action of a man committed to the operation's success. During the Thursday action, he had drawn no weapon, advanced on no civilian, and ceased. Resistance immediately upon being identified. She said these things without softening them with emotion, and without hardening them with accusation. Just facts in their correct order. Carmody listened. He wrote. He did not thank her or praise her, which was the thing she respected most about him. He treated her information with the same weight he gave everyone's information, which was the only kind of respect worth having. On Sunday, he came to the jailhouse and told Colt directly that his sentencing was no longer a foregone conclusion. Colt looked at the barred window. He said, "All right." And this time the word sounded different, like a door opening rather than closing. Silas Vane was indicted on 4 counts in 3 jurisdictions. His lawyers arrived from Fort Worth in 48 hours, which confirmed what Wren had half known, that Vane operated at a scale that Dustwater had simply been too small to see the edges of. She thought about what he'd said by the fire, that she had cost Colt his future, and Vane had given him a new one. She sat with that sentence for a long time. She didn't make it smaller than it was. It was true, in the way the most painful things are true, not entirely, not completely, but enough that arguing with it would have been dishonest. She had made a decision in April that she'd dressed as practicality when it was partly fear. She had waited when she should have moved. She had been certain she had more time when certainty itself was the mistake. These were not comfortable things to know about yourself. She knew them anyway, because the only version of making it right required being honest about having made it wrong. And Wren Calloway, for all her flaws, had never been a person who traded clarity for comfort. The district judge in Adelanto sentenced Colt to 6 months at the county work camp and 2 years supervised probation. Wren did not argue the sentence. It was not unjust. The stagecoach job was real. His participation was real, and a world where actions had no consequence was not a world that could be lived in safely by anyone. She wrote him every month, functional letters shaped to what she knew he actually needed, which was not sentiment, but the continued evidence of presence, proof that the world he was returning to still existed and still had his shape in it. She told him about the ranch. The fence posts along the north line had finally been straightened by her own hands and old Pepper's on a Sunday in December. She told him the debt had been restructured, a longer payment arrangement through the man from Amarillo who turned out to be a consolidator, not a creditor, buying the ranch 3 years of breathing room. She told him her mother's condition had stabilized, that the doctor in Amarillo used the word manageable, which was not the same as well, but was so much better than the alternative that manageable sounded to Wren like music. She told him the south pasture was still gone. Things stayed changed, she wrote, and that is all right. He wrote back, short letters, dense with the specific details that showed he'd read hers closely. He asked about the garden. He asked about the bay horse. In February, he wrote 4 sentences, and she read the 3rd one until the fold in the paper started to thin. I have been thinking about what it means to want something so much that you convince yourself the wanting itself is the problem. I think that was both of us. She kept that letter folded inside her Bible without pretending she didn't. He asked once, near the end, if she still had something, and didn't say what. And she understood what he meant, and she wrote back, yes, both things. He wrote back, good. 2 people communicating entirely in what they didn't say, because by then they'd both learned what unsaid things cost. He came back to Dustwater on a Thursday morning in early autumn. the anniversary of Vane's arrival almost to the week, and the symmetry of that timing was something she'd note later when she could find the quiet for it. He came on a plain bay horse, working stock, nothing showy, the kind of animal chosen by a man who'd returned to caring about function over impression. And the old brown hat, the battered one with the frayed brim she'd always teased him about, back on his head like it had never been anywhere else. She was in the kitchen garden when she heard him on the south road, her hands in the turned earth, pulling the last of the season's sage up by the roots for drying, her fingers dark with the good honest smell of soil. And she stood and turned. He came through the gate and pulled up, and they looked at each other across 10 feet of open autumn air. He was older, not broken older, the other kind, the kind that came from surviving something difficult all the way through rather than part way and giving up, the kind that lived in the face differently. He had a new scar over his right eye, thin and white, where the cut from the deputy's tackle had healed. It was visible in the morning light, and she looked at it directly, the way you look at evidence of a thing that happened and cannot unhappen. And she did not look away. He dismounted. He came through the gate and stopped 6 feet from her. She was holding a clump of sage roots still trailing soil, both hands dark, the smell of earth and autumn rising off everything around them. He reached into his coat, the old canvas one, the brown one, the one she'd found the ring in, and brought out both, the ring, small and plain, still wrapped in the leather strip, and pressed flat beside it, preserved against everything time should have done to it, the dried sage sprig, the same one, still holding its smell. He said, "I took both when I left. I didn't know why. I think I did know why." She looked at them lying together in his palm, the ring and the sage, cold November, things now in autumn warmth, and she felt the full weight of the two. Years land on her shoulders at once, the refusal, the drift, the barn, the camp, the gunsmoke, the 6 months of letters, the sentence in February she'd read until the fold thinned. Rather than crushing her, the weight felt like ground, solid, the kind you stand on and build from. She reached forward and took the ring with her soil-dark hands, warm from the earth, nothing like the cold morning she'd first held it. And she said yes, simply, immediately, no architecture, no arithmetic, just the word, clean and complete, the way it should have come out the first time in a kitchen garden in April. Then she pressed the sage sprig back into his open palm and closed his fingers around it. He looked down at his own hand a moment, then up at her. The sage smell rose between them in the autumn air. The Cimarron wind moved through the garden. The north fence stood straight and solid in the October light, and somewhere in the house behind her, Nora Calloway set down her mending, looked out. The kitchen window, and after everything, after all of it, finally, quietly, smiled.